Hello and welcome to Tete à Tete, France 24's flagship interview show. Our guest today is Aaron David Miller. He is a former Middle East negotiator at the US State Department. He's now a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace in Washington, D.C., where he joins us from. Thank you very much, Mr. Miller.
Thanks for having me.
So you're obviously a veteran of Middle East diplomacy. You've been involved in umpteenth talk between U.S. and Israeli officials. We're seeing the tensions escalate between the Biden administration and Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu over the war in Gaza. In addition to repeated warnings over an offensive on the town of Rafah, the lack of planning for the day after, Washington has decided to suspend some arms shipments to Jerusalem. Is this unprecedented for you?
Not unprecedented. As you know, there have been varying moments in the course of the U.S.-Israeli relationship where American presidents acted, in fact, in some respects, much more forcefully. In 1957, Eisenhower threatened sanctions against Ben-Gurion, against Israel, if the Israelis did not withdraw their forces from Sinai as part of the British-French-Israeli plan to seize the canal from Egypt's Nasser. The Reagan administration, president, at least 3 times during his presidency, delayed the shipment of arms, F-16s, over Israel's bombing of Beirut, the Israeli attack on the Iraqi nuclear reactor, and again in late 1981 against the Begin government's, Menachem Begin government's decision to expand or extend administrative law and jurisdiction over the Golan Heights. Not unprecedented, but I must say that I think you need to step back and take a look at what I believe is perhaps in many respects the most fraught and stressful period in the U.S.-Israeli relationship, in large part because the 2 fundamental drivers of that relationship, shared values and the perception that Israel and the U.S. have a high coincidence of shared interests. I think over the last decade and a half, perhaps longer, those 2 drivers of the relationship, which have accounted for its resiliency, its sustainability, I think have become more fraught. So I think you have to factor that into the current equation. That said, I don't think the Biden administration, for any number of reasons, we can talk about it, is prepared to adopt steps that would create a sustained public breach between the United States and Israel. If the administration is to have any hope of extricating itself from Gaza anytime soon, it will have to do so in conjunction with, not over the opposition of, the current Israeli government. That's a very tough pill for some to swallow, but I think it's the only way that the Americans are going to get the Israelis to de-escalate their military activity in Gaza, surge humanitarian assistance, free the hostages, and set the stage for what the administration still believes, however fanciful it may appear and be, a regional peace initiative whose centerpiece is an Israeli-Saudi normalization package.
Right. But to many observers, Biden himself, the administration, are getting frustrated with Israel because they seem to believe Israel is not listening to them, that they may try to coerce Israel, maybe to take some steps for humanitarian aid, for thinking about the day after, but that no one is listening in Jerusalem.
You know, I think to a degree, the president's personal frustration is rising. I think he now understands, 8 months after this war has begun, that he's no longer dealing with the Netanyahu of old, the Benjamin Netanyahu of old, the risk-averse Netanyahu, who was relatively careful, 1 step forward, 1 step to the side, 1 step backward. He's dealing now with a much more risk-ready Benjamin Netanyahu, on trial for bribery, fraud, breach of trust. I think alone among Israeli politicians, the man who must and wants to stay in power and will probably do anything within reasonable limits, set, of course, by the Israeli political system and those who oppose him, to stay in power. And I think that has created enormous frustration, whether it's the absence of planning for the day after, whether it's the slow walking of Israelis facilitating humanitarian assistance into Gaza, or now, as we see, whether it's a perhaps or perhaps not a looming crisis between the U.S. and Israel over how the Israelis intend to proceed in Rafah. I would only point out that while the administration has paused, suspended a single shipment of high maximum munitions, roughly 3,500, 2,500 pound bombs. This occurs against the backdrop of a $26 billion congressional appropriation for Ukraine, for Taiwan, and for Israel. Israel's share is $14 billion. And the administration has in the pipeline another $780 million of munitions and offensive military equipment for the Israelis. So this is not an embargo. I don't think we stand on the cusp of what I would call a breach, a sustained breach in the relationship, which would prevent the relationship from functioning. I don't think that's what we're talking about, but there's no doubt that the longer this war continues, I think the greater the chances are the tensions are going to increase and intensify.
Right. Do you share the assessment that there's growing skepticism in Washington was expressed by Secretary of State Blinken, National Security Advisor Sullivan, that Israel is not pursuing the right strategy, even military-wise, that focusing on Rafah has allowed Hamas to reemerge in other parts of the Gaza Strip, that the Hamas leaders might not be where Israel think there is. It seems that Washington is doubting even Israel's military strategy.
You know, I think it extends far beyond Washington, which is more or less inside the bubble. I mean, Washington is forced to pull their punches, obviously, because they want to maintain a relationship, a functional one, in an effort to extricate the president from Gaza. But the reality is most analysts, and I would include myself among them, even though the threat perceptions between Israel and the United States are fundamentally different. I mean, we lost 3,000 Americans on 9/11. It translates into 40,000 Israelis, and we didn't have a proximity problem with Al Qaeda or the Islamic State. The Israelis have a proximity problem with the Islamic resistance movement, with Hamas. That said, somewhere along the line, Israeli military planners and certainly the political establishment lost touch with one fundamental basic reality, that military power, however effective tactically, is merely an instrument to achieve a set of sustainable and hopefully advantageous political goals. And I think that's where the strategy, if in fact there was a strategy with respect to Gaza, has essentially broken down. You now see a situation 8 months into this war where both the headlines and the trend lines suggest the following. Hamas is going to survive in some form, maybe as an insurgency, given the weakness of the Palestinian national movement. It's likely through intimidation and co-optation to continue to play a critical role in the formation of Palestinian politics, both in Gaza and perhaps even beyond that, given the weakness of the Palestinian Authority. Number two, there's no Palestinian governing structure that is near ready to assume power in Gaza. I mean, I think that's an understatement. There's no legitimacy. Mahmoud Abbas is an 89-year-old man in the 19th year of a 4-year term. He controls 40% of the West Bank. There's corruption, there's nepotism, and the Israelis, to a large degree, weaken Abbas by essentially disempowering him as a consequence of their policies in the West Bank. And finally, I think you're left with the inexorable situation that there'll be no turnkey government to impose security. There are no Arab states dying, eager to deploy their own boots on the ground. You're going to end up with a situation in which the government of Israel, whether it's Netanyahu's or an alternative government, is in many respects going to be stuck in Gaza. Maybe not a military government, but the Israelis will reserve the right to go in and out. They're creating a buffer zone along the entire 36-mile stretch of Israel's border with Gaza. So we have a situation in which Gaza is going to remain, to say the least, unsettled. It may not be Somalia, but the reality is it's certainly not going to be the kind of place that the 2.3 million Palestinians, with respect to their security and prosperity, deserve or are likely to get.
Right. Just as a last question, obviously on the table, there is this kind of grand bargain whereby Israel and Saudi Arabia will normalize a relationship with a major boost from the U.S. in terms of economics, nuclear power, and so on. Is this a pie in the sky given the situation you just described in Gaza?
Right now, it is a plan tethered far more suitably to a galaxy far, far away than it is to the realities back here on planet Earth. That said, if in fact there was will and skill with respect to doing what is necessary in Gaza, planning for the day after, empowering a Palestinian governing structure, trying to distinguish in a much better way between civilian casualties and Hamas fighters, and beginning to take more seriously humanitarian assistance into Gaza, and a recognition by everyone, the United States, the government of Israel, and the Arab states, that Gaza first cannot be Gaza only. A political process, a political horizon. Under those circumstances, it is not unimaginable. I hate double negatives. Let's say it is imaginable to conceive that such a regional initiative could actually gain traction.
Aaron Miller, I want to thank you very much for appearing here on France 24 from Washington, D.C. And thank you all for watching this show.